Welcome to the Trailblazers. I'm Perry Rarick, your host. The purpose of the Trailblazers is to share with you interesting and thought provoking discussions I have with trailblazing business leaders. They're innovative, they're experts at what they do, and they're not afraid to challenge the status quo. My trailblazer guest today is Joe Renny. He is the head of corporate development at CatSci, a Keensight Capital backed company, a UK based contract research organization, which is a limiting term. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. They have an expertise in small molecules, oligonucleotides, peptides, and advanced medicines, but truly they operate as an innovation partner to the pharmaceutical industry. They are much bigger than your typical contract research organization. Joe is a strategic leader at the intersection of science and business. That's a busy intersection in which he is responsible for driving growth strategy, acquisitions, and partnerships. Joe also has an extensive background and experience in science. He earned his PhD in chemistry at the University of Bristol in collaboration with AstraZeneca, followed by postdoctoral research at the Weizmann Institute of Science and Cornell University. Early in his career at Dow Chemical, he worked with pioneering teams advancing catalytic processes and new materials before pivoting, a big pivot, into strategy and deal making. Awarded a scholarship for his MBA at Warwick Business School, Joe has since built a track record in M&A execution, private equity advisory, and cross-border partnerships that translate deep science into commercial value. Wow. And he's here with us today. Joe, welcome to the Trailblazers.
Great to be with you, Perry. Thank you very much indeed. I'm quite humbled.
Awesome to have you. It's just great to have you with us, and I think the timing is awesome. I woke up to the announcement, and we all expected that the federal government in the United States is frozen, no funding, and they've closed down. And that's happened before, and I'm not sure how long it's going to happen, or how long it will be, or what that means. But it kind of symbolizes the one word everybody I talk to in the pharmaceutical industry and even in business in general, the one word that describes the current conditions is uncertain. It's really uncertain. We don't know what each day or week brings to us that presents a new set of challenges. Our topic today is global economic uncertainty. The timing is just incredibly accurate. Specifically in a pharmaceutical industry, and more specifically with contract development and manufacturing organizations, contract research organizations, and to borrow your term and how you see your role at CatSci, innovative partners. The industry is always looking for that, not just some kind of contractual relationship. So, Joe, you believe that Europe's CDMO and CRO sector is at a pivotal juncture, navigating a complex interplay of economic restructuring, geopolitical shifts, and evolving regulatory demands. Why do you believe that?
Thank you for the introduction. I think that you've captured the circumstances extremely well. There's a term that was coined in the sort of like 1980s, I think maybe 70s and 80s, by this US military, VUCA, so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it seems to be an evergreen term at the moment. So right now, the macroeconomic conditions indicate a slowdown globally, that all economies are not growing as rapidly as they were. Post-COVID, healthcare systems are under a great deal of pressure. And we had a big spike in investment in biotech. And now, indexes like the XBI, where you'd normally value biotech companies, have declined very significantly in value since their peak in 2021. We've got a war on the continent of Europe, which is impacting supply chains. And you've got lower cost regions, India and China, particularly China, that has really developed their capabilities to be CDMOs, but also to be innovators and to develop first-in-class medicines. So that's a really significant change that's taken place over the last 20 years. And I think that all of that comes together to make quite an uncertain time, especially when we consider, the FDA is really the leading regulator in the world, and everyone's looking to the FDA in the US for certainty often in industry. And so making investments right now in biotech is very, very challenging, and that impacts all downstream activities in CROs and CDMOs.
You captured that expertly. That's incredible. You got it all. Thank you for mentioning war in Europe. We don't often hear it referenced that way in the United States. It's a little more distance. People are more caught up in, it's a little further away from us, but you're much closer to that. And we've seen this happen before. So thank you for mentioning that. We hope, they find that a solution is found. In India, I was just talking to somebody yesterday, a company in India that the tariffs, they monitor tariffs on a like on a daily basis, shifting tariffs and how it impacts them. They have new roles in their company that, tariff experts within their organization. So it's really amazing. The other thing that you mentioned to me in a previous call is that a lot of people I talk to are kind of holding their breath, thinking that everything you just described is, we've got a couple years of this and then we'll get back to normal. You believe this is the new normal in a grand way, in an era type sense. This is going to be with us for a long time.
Yeah, I think that maybe the tectonic shifts are kind of like tectonic plates are shifting beneath us, and that in the past where China might have been viewed as a cheap source of labor, has really been very significantly invested in, and so now the the question remains whether China can productively absorb all of the investment that's been made, and that actually leads to productive economic output, particularly when they're in a deflationary cycle. But fundamentally, they're now both innovators and amazing developers of medicines. So they do discovery very well, but they also act as contract development organizations, contract manufacturing organizations, CDMOs, CROs for Western industry, and in particular, even in the US. So many consultants that I work with who work with pharma and biotech companies will outsource to China for both R&D and manufacturing because there's a cost advantage. And interestingly, just to quote a figure, a chemistry drug discovery FTE would be about $70,000. It's even cheaper in India now. So the cost for the Chinese is going up as well, but they risk being undercut by India. And obviously the Biosecure Act presents a really interesting, or the prospect of the Biosecure Act presents a really interesting scenario where many large pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies are looking at the resilience of their supply chains and saying, okay, yes, we've got a cost advantage in China, but what if there is a tariff issue? Shouldn't we look at India? And so there's a lot of de-risking now going on and bringing work back into Europe and into regions like India, which are increasing their quality and the strength of their organizations and attracting large-scale foreign investment as well. Like, for example, Advent International's investment into Cohance and the buy and build strategy there.
Yeah, you turned your attention to Europe there. Great assessment of China, but you also think this is opportunistic for European-based CDMOs and CROs.
If we look at Europe, Europe's always been far more the provider of services to develop medicines. Typically, the ecosystem for venture investment in Europe is weaker than in the US. And therefore, in the US, you've attracted many people into biotech, and therefore, fewer people have gone into biotech in Europe. Therefore, the CROs and CDMOs have often been scientifically very strong. and there's been significant discussion of deindustrialization in Europe. And in fact, some economists would argue that it's more really the rebalancing of the type of activities that are taking place. And so if we look at high value R&D and high value manufacturing in Europe as the strategic opportunity for the continent to leverage its knowledge base and actually to leverage its regulatory system, that could be particularly advantageous.
Certainly, from the certainly there's Europe and the United States, North America seems much more compatibly, than Asia. But I don't want to rule out Asia either. But certainly, and it could be subjective. I think our regulatory bodies are a little more comfortable with one another. But what about, so as somebody who's seated in Europe, how are you viewing all of this goings on coming out of the continental United States?
Um, I guess I never regard anything in the arc of history as completely unprecedented. If one takes the long view, um, you've still got very fine institutions. You've got amongst the world's best universities, if not the best universities in the world. Um, some of the greatest R&D based companies in the pharmaceutical and biotech sector, not to mention other advanced industries that are emerging in AI, for example, and the application of AI in drug discovery and drug development. And so I think, as you said, there's a natural synergy and a cultural synergy to some extent between Europe from a regulatory perspective and from a doing business perspective and a respect for intellectual property and ways of working and business, which could create a good synergy and continue to create a good synergy between the US as well. And I think that one country that's taken very significant advantage of it is Ireland, where many manufacturing organizations and CDMOs, CROs work particularly well there with North American customers. And obviously, there's a shared language and an enjoyable culture as well.
Yeah, yeah, great point. If so, if I'm a drug innovator, I'm one of those R&D oriented organizations, and I'm looking to outsource. What should I think of top of mind when I consider Europe, besides what you already brought up, some of the synergies?
One of the things that I would consider is freedom to operate, and that you don't have. If you're a biotech, the last thing that you want to do is pay licensing fees, um, and have an unpredictable timelines around accessing your product. And I think over time, one of the things that may be complicated by tariffs and could be advantageous is that Europe would be able to handle from across the continent within the European Economic Area the ability to handle tariffs en masse as one block rather than as one country. And I think that that would advantage aspects of making sure that your supply chain are held robust as you go through maybe later stage past clinical trials into commercialization.
Now, you believe that one of the solutions, one of the answers for meeting all of these challenges that you've been describing is something called anti-fragility. I love that term. You talked about to me building anti-fragile CDMO operations. Can you educate me and our audience on what does that mean? What is anti-fragile? What are the origins of this idea? How did you find it? And how does it apply to CDMO operations?
Sure. Um, I guess in reality, what I was looking for was an overarching concept that would move beyond the notion of we have a resilient organization or we have redundancy in our organization. And I was trying to think about our own organization as a very small player in the industry and how we could become successful, what the strategy would need to be for us to become successful over time. And so if something's resilient, it's able to withstand the shock that takes place. But as I've kind of indicated, Europe's been captured by, or the world has been captured by one crisis after another, whether it was COVID, whether it was sort of like, fiscal tightening, etc. So it's not just about bouncing back better, but it's a concept that was coined by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who's an economist, and it describes systems that go beyond withstanding shocks and actually grow stronger because of them. So they're able to take an advantage of the current circumstances that they're uh, facing.
So can I
Absolutely.
So I think that's really an important distinction. If I can,
Yeah.
can you go back that and say that again, just in case we all missed it? This isn't
Right.
about just
Yeah.
surviving the initial shock. This is
Yeah.
last.
Yeah. So I'll just take something that I've written, coined, and read it out. So anti-fragility describes a system that doesn't just withstand the shock, that's resilience, but actually grows stronger because of those shocks. So in other words, it's although it's bound in Taleb's coining of it, I think that some of the thinking goes back earlier to people like Schumpeter and Kondratiev. So Schumpeter, who talked about gales of creative destruction, and Kondratiev, who was talking about these kind of like waves way of innovation, where you have steam, you have electrification, telecommunication, sort of biotech, and now the AI era. And the distance between those innovations or those waves having an economic impact is perhaps getting closer and closer. And the top of those waves is probably becoming even more significant. And that's why I think we're in a kind of a new normal. Um, it's often said that, or perhaps it should be said, that we overestimate the importance of a technology and the impact it's going to have in the short term, but we underestimate its long-term consequence. So I don't even think we know what the value and the consequence of AI on society, positive and negative, is going to be yet, because it's simply too hard to grip that at the moment, and we don't have that foresight yet. So anti-fragility as a concept I like, because you're really thinking about how you can structure the organization to grow and go in different directions. And I think that's more than a strategic pivot. And it captures for me more of an ecosystem focus as well.
Yeah, very interesting. And when I speak to you, my reading list grows all the time. So I'm taking notes as you're speaking about some of the authors. So thank you for that. And our audience does too. All right. So you have identified five key features of an anti-fragile operation within I'm going to say CDMO and CRO, but these outsourcing organizations. Can you walk us through those key features briefly? Kind of introduce us to them.
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll think about it from an ecosystem perspective, and then how they relate to the part of the industry that I'm in. But number one, diversified supply chain. So how can you spread the risk? And that clearly makes sense when you've got hyperscaled companies. Number two, modular and digital manufacturing. So you've got agility and you've got speed. So the chemicals industry was very good about thinking about digital twins, like probably decades ago, for large scale reactors and static processes. And now we're even thinking about digital twins for genetic models, for example, which is quite amazing in the drug discovery space. But how can we turn regulation into an advantage? So how does the fact that Europe has a stable regulatory environment help? What does that mean from a compliance as a selling point? You know, um, and what does that mean in terms of like quality and differentiation? For example, how can ESG be a value creator, which many large private equity funds are now looking at, rather than just something that is a burden that you have to manage? And how does that provide stability? And then number four, perhaps, how can we think about specialization, and how is that niche excellence relevant to those new waves of drugs and treatments that are going to be emerging? We are moving away from just thinking about classic small molecules. We've had biologics for some time now, but we're looking at molecules which are hybrid. and they really work on undruggable space. So what can you do in that area that gives you a level of like niche capability and specialization? And then what does strategic M&A and scale and smart growth allow you to do?
I want to ask you a few questions about each of these, and I'm not going to go in any order that makes sense, I don't think, but I'm going to ask anyway. You talk about specialization, that, and so is this going to, are we going to move away from the one-stop shop, the CDMOs and CROs that do it all? Are companies going to be specialized, or is it specialized capabilities within those large companies?
I think for hyperscaled organizations, it's hard to maintain that focus on niche capability and excellence and execution excellence. However, I think if you look at Cambrex, if I'm not mistaken, the acquisition of Snapdragon is a good example of where the niche excellence of that organization, particularly in flow chemistry, developing like new processes to make peptides in particular in solution, is seen as particularly attractive in a market where, GLP-1s like Wegovy, Ozempic, Zepbound are going to be incredibly important and incredibly valuable for healthcare systems, because however expensive they are, they're much less expensive than treating people's diseases because they're obese, right? And so actually that's an example of where, niche excellence and that strategic M&A there probably adds a lot of value to that organization in a way that allows its technology to be evergreen to address, the new types of molecules that are going to be developed in the clinic and need to be commercialized.
And so you started out by talking about diversification of suppliers, big supply chain issue. Supply chain, I think in COVID was a big wake up call for the world, in that we had way too much risk in our supply chains. And these specialist supply chain experts took on a bigger role. How should these companies, how should they see that supply chain role? Is that a new value proposition from these CDMOs and CROs when they come to the table and discuss long-term partnerships?
I think when you've got CDMOs looking at partnerships with very large organizations or CROs, for example, like top 10, top 50 pharma, that are likely to have very high volume drugs, even in the current environment that's moving towards more niche and specialized treatments which have high value. The move by Novo Nordisk to acquire Catalent
Yeah.
so that it could have sterile fill finish capability to serve the volume uh, of patient need that they were anticipating uh, is particularly significant. And so I would go even further back that actually the many basic chemicals are being produced in China. China is particularly important in making nucleotides and the starting materials for those that will make oligonucleotides and other RNA-based therapies. And mm, there needs to be a recognition of the importance, I think, of aspects of the chemical industry to integrate within the supply chain of the pharmaceutical industry and medicine development uh, that does go into CDMO. And I think addressing that vulnerability requires an ecosystem approach. The US still has many fine chemical companies, but you want chemical production appropriately distributed throughout the world. In terms of basic materials, Lonza is one of the only CDMOs that I can think of that has their own or that has access to a cracker on its site in Visp to make basic materials that would go into its production of key intermediates to make very important API that are relevant on a commercial scale. So I think that it's important for the CDMOs and it's important for big pharma and the wider healthcare ecosystem as well. And often that's divorced until you experience something like COVID where, you're wondering where you're going to get your aprons from. You're wondering where you're going to get your lateral flow test from. But actually even basic materials like, the alcohol that you need to make sterile hand rub, sterilizing hand gel is particularly important.
Yeah, incredible. Uh, What does this mean to regulatory oversight bodies? They tend to be geographically oriented, national. EU, of course, that is one. Are they going to become more cooperative? Are they going to collaborate more? Will we see a global regulatory organization?
I think that it would be to everyone's advantage to look at as much as possible harmonization of regulations, particularly around innovative therapies where some of the decisions are extremely complex. Um, the ethics committees involved in US based decisions on the FDA have always been very well regarded, and has been regarded as very professional, very agile. And I think the US has got a good system in terms of it has one regulatory body which acts very much as a leader for the rest of the industry. But in Europe, the advantage for Europe is to actually say, rather than looking at each individual country's approach to regulation, let's look at it on a continental level through the European Medicines Agency, and what implications should that have for pricing and market access in those member states of the European Union or the European Economic Area. And there's a significant advantage in making the environment more predictable, particularly when you're looking at filing INDs, you know, NCEs. And I would say that actually harmonization is very valuable and very important, especially as you start to see innovation coming from China, and from other regions. And I imagine that is something that will be a long-term trend. It will go up and down, and that, you know, China has its own internal issues, but closer regulatory alignment and communication about how to have that strategic value from that regulatory alignment is very important.
Yeah. Uh, when we talk about things this way, understanding, you offered a very clear understanding of the challenges. You proposed five key features of CDMOs and CROs to be anti-fragile, and intellectually, it all makes sense. But the hard thing to do is change the way we think about these things and follow it up with a behavioral change that actually implements all of this. Uh, and it usually lags a little bit. Uh, that has got that I expect that that will be a big challenge. Sometimes we're just pressured into it because of the conditions are so painful that people are forced to change. What advice would you have for these organizations as they approach this in thinking about this differently?
I think to keep an open mind, and to be prepared for those changes that are likely to take place over time. And I think they'll be driven by need. And so it genuinely is to create an anti-fragile system that is flexible to those changes and those demands. We've already talked about tariffs, right? Or not in great depth, but we've mentioned that, right? And so my attitude is that the industry needs to find ways of working around the circumstances that it finds, rather than thinking that, okay, they're going to change in 1, 2, 3, 4 years' time. And I would say that we're going to be in a better place if we accept the current level of pressures that are taking place across the industry. If that happens, I think that's going to bring back some level of investor confidence to make, to make strategic decisions in certain areas that are likely to drive long-term value. And I think that will then cause the rest of the market to follow. Clearly, interest rates are, are too high at the moment to provoke the same level of investment. Um, but I think that it's keeping an open mind that's important, and not assuming that things are going to stay a particular way. I would expect change, and that's a massive mindset for, mindset change for most of us who've been used to the last 20 years of the industry being a certain way and moving into a certain direction, where biotech really acts as, the drivers of new innovation. CROs and CDMOs have their place in helping them to deliver that and get to a point of exit that pharma then commercializes. And that's probably a bit more bumpy now than it has been over the last 20 years.
Yeah, when it comes to change and innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, everybody wants to be innovative, but nobody wants to be first. It's it's a bit of a dilemma, and a lot of it often
Number
point.
four, right?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Forgive me, Perry. Lipitor was number four. Yep, in terms of like entering the market, but it was the best number four, right? Sorry.
Great point. And often we kind of use uh, we're a heavily regulated industry, and we kind of use that as an excuse. So I'm with you. I hope we can change this mindset and move on. I want to look at this from. So I host a series of events in which CDMOs and CROs are presenting their capabilities to a number of drug innovators, the drug sponsors, and there's some selection criteria that they use to pick the right partnership. It seems like that's going to be there's going to be a lot of changes. I think the criteria they use may undergo a lot of change in this environment that you're talking about.
Mm. I think you're right. I think that although it's come under pressure at the moment, that ESG, uh, environmentally productive processes are going to continue to be important because actually handling waste is costly. So that's going to continue to be a criteria from the point of view of strategic cost advantage for large pharma companies in choosing their providers and developing the most innovative processes possible.
Yeah, really great point. I had never thought about it. You're bringing up so many good points. This is really a valuable discussion. Another group of people that are looking at CDMOs and CROs and having to make a decisions are investors. That we need money injected into these organizations to keep them thriving as well. And that seems to be that will be undergoing some changes as well. Those short-term wins, I don't want to say they be non-existent, but I think that maybe there's a longer term look at the value of some of these organizations and how we evaluate them.
I'd agree with that entirely. I spoke to a very large scale private equity fund within the last week with significant amount of capital under investment across the US and even in China as well. And it was a very mature organization, and they were very interested in new technology to make peptides, for example. And the reason why they're interested in new technology to make peptides is because everyone's interested in GLP-1s at the moment, and that's kind of the gold rush. But what I was saying to them was actually the technology that's being developed in these organizations that are highly competent at making these types of medicines is going to be relevant to the next wave of medicines that we don't even know are, we kind of know that they're coming, but they're not obviously massive clinical successes in phase 3 going to commercialization at the moment. And so obviously antibody drug conjugates are one of those examples. Keytruda is a great product and saved many lives and helped many people. But there are others like, peptide drug conjugates, oligonucleotide drug conjugates that are going to be particularly important. And so if you then bear in mind your investment in a CRO or a CDMO that has those capabilities and they're able to practice in that niche, there's the opportunity for them to continue to grow as the nature of drug discovery and drug development matures into that direction. Small molecules will continue to be incredibly important, but they'll probably experience captive growth, where some of these other newer modalities of drug that will drive need in CDMOs will be in double-digit figures.
Excellent stuff, Joe. Thank you. Very exciting. I know that we talked a lot about challenges, and it seems daunting, but The very best rise up, and those are the people we remember in history. So I know you're fond of quoting Churchill, and I put him at the top of the list of somebody who under difficult circumstances and rose, and we remember him. So, Joe, thank you very much. I hope we can catch up perhaps in a year from now and see where all of this stands, and maybe a year after that. This would be something I would love to continue to revisit if you are okay with that.
Oh, I'd be super grateful. Thank you so much for your time, Perry.
Yeah. My guest today has been Joe Renny. He is the head of corporate development at a great organization called CatSci. They are a Keysight capital based back company located in the UK. They are a contract research organization, but probably more accurately, an innovation partner. And I think you can see why, as Joe has been talking long term about the challenges we're facing and some of the very interesting solutions he's bringing to the table. So, Joe, thank you very much for being with the Trailblazers today.
Thanks again, Perry.